Welcome to the thematic presentation on sex, eroticism in ceramics. Sex is also one of those themes that's often passed over or ignored within the context of ceramics, where it does play a very significant role historically as well as today in so many different ways. And of course, there is also an element of humor and fun and pleasure to sex and its relation to ceramics. And this art collective from Austria pushes that connection between clay and sexuality to extreme by engaging in very dynamic sexual acts with the material itself in performances that are then documented and create objects that can be presented as artworks. And again, the pioneer George Orr with his vagina bank and a vase, a menstrual vase in menstrual colors with forms reminiscent of both male and female sexual aspects. And ceramics is the ideal material and art form for those kinds of investigation. And of course, we see many examples of that in all kinds of kitschware and souvenirs and very light objects that are produced all over the world. Really, they're quite popular in many cultures. While other artists will investigate this amazing relationship between sex, reproduction, sexuality, the cycle of regeneration and in nature and so on. And clay, ceramic, and sexuality are deeply connected in so many different ways. And in the reading for this theme, there will be an analysis of that relationship, but I'm just showing you a lot of example here because the variety is quite large. You have major artists like Jeff Koons working in porcelain, investigating those potentials. Sometimes again, self-portraits here. There will be a lot of sexual representation, of course, in such a theme. Tons of penises, in all kinds of contexts, in the context of drink, in the context of food, in the context of plants and growth and generation and so on. But one has to approach this kind of material with a very open mind in a way and see beyond the obvious nature of those kinds of representations to what they imply, what they can mean, and what is the signification that they carry. And those works in ceramics by Juan Miró, the famous surrealist artist, again, they are like primitive idols from the Neolithic, combining aspects of female power related to regeneration and the production of new beings for humans. Pablo Picasso with the breast bowl, and the very famous breast bowl of 1766 by Jean-Jacques Lagrenet, made in France in porcelain for Marie Antoinette so she could drink her milk out of it. And it's a very influential object that has been reinterpreted by various makers because it's a very beautiful object, first of all, and it carries such interesting connotation at the level of whiteness of porcelain, whiteness of milk, and it's full of possibilities for metaphors and relationships. And even artists working in other material than ceramics, like Tom Sachs, have used that work. And again, working at Sèvres, Hubert Barrère has made one of his breast milk bowl in relation with the body specifically. And it's quite interesting to see at the level of fetishism as well, the way we obsess over those objects, whether they be sexual objects or physical objects made out of clay and porcelain and ceramic material, the way they engage with fetishism and our obsessions with shoes and with body parts and so on. And many artists are investigating those things. the seminal and very extraordinary work of Akio Takamori, again speaking of that amazing relationship between sexuality and spirituality and a connection with nature at a very deep, fundamental level. Judy Chicago, The Dinner Party, resurfaces again in that theme as well. We've seen this work in a number of contexts so far, but the work is, of course, deeply sexualized with stylized and abstracted images of vagina and female sexuality in many various ways. This is a series of tiles, Sex from the Inside Out, that she painted. And recently she has commercialized editions of some of her plates that you can buy on the internet. So that's an interesting relationship again between sexuality and commercial endeavor and the diffusion of an image over space and time in a variety of contexts, and going outside the art context specifically to engage again with domesticity, with giftware in ways that ceramics is ideally positioned to do. At last year's Venice Biennale, this artist presented this huge installation combining multimedia aspects, including those very large vaginal ceramic sculptural objects. And I have quite a wide selections of possibilities here, again engaging with food, engaging with connotations, with all kinds of contexts. In the late 60s, early 70s, those kinds of investigation in ceramics around, making fun of things and engaging within the struggle between men and women and feminism and masculinity and so on, that generated work of great potency and great interest. And Ken Price, with his Apis Curios that he made for his wife in 1974, and celebrating the relationship he had with her female body and the sexuality that they engage with. And Ken Price again on the left with an abstracted penile form of great sensibility. And things don't always have to be graphic and first degree. Sometimes the sexual relationship is quite subtle and very sophisticated in many ways. And in the 1960s, Glenn Lewis made those wonderful fairy rings that are salt and pepper shakers thrown on the wheel and reassembled in all kinds of contexts and organizations of form. And he made a large mural for the Osaka International Fair in 1984 that created quite a stir. It was censored by the government and so on, but it's basically just a diary of what happened over a certain amount of time in his life, and each day he sort of celebrated something that had happened in an ordinary context. While Ann Davis Mulford here with her lesbian heaven and references to fish and pussy and the use of language again and all kinds of connotation that exists between sexuality, sexual parts, and words that we use to speak of it, to not name the thing directly. So there is a certain obfuscation sometimes at work. This is just a cup, saucer, and spoon covered in furs, but it implies tremendous amount of sexual relationship at the level of touch and handling and potential use. And something similar is at work here in the work of Liu Jianhua. Why are those figures in such positions? Why don't they have heads and arms? Why are they located on plates? Are they food? Are they offering themselves? Are they victim of something? There is a tremendous amount of complexity in those works. And an artist from Cuba here exploring the relationship between his island nation and Marxism and politics, and how politics and sexuality, when the island is represented as a female figure engaging in sex with Karl Marx, creates wonderful possibilities for social commentary. While Sally Mitchner here did the same thing in the relationship between men and women, with her women impaled on a pedestal and man watching maiden dancings from 1979. So this is just a selection of works again to show you all the variety of things that are possible. We've looked at those very objects before in the relations of the classical aesthetic, of the narrative aesthetics. Here they are in the context of sexuality itself, the way landscapes and bodies are sexualized in various ways, and how we relate to bodies and how we represent them, and what happens when that representation finds itself in the context of a sauce bowl. That's a functional object that's also meant to be handled, brought to the mouth, speaks of food, speaks of sharing and generosity, and all those issues that are quite interesting. And what happens again when those kind of rather controversial, rather difficult subject matter finds themselves in the context of a plate with gender issues of transsexuality and homosexuality, and it can become quite complex in so many ways. And bodies painted in blue and white, and speaking of relationship and communication and exchange. And there is a vast history of that type of material in historical time. I'm focusing here specifically on contemporary ceramics. And you see in this plate by Angela Fina, for example, the sexual references the sexual references are rather subtle. Of course, fruits have a lot of sexual connotations. You have a banana, an orange, a lemon, and a walnut here, and B for banana, O for orange, L for lemon, and W for walnut. But it also spells the word blow, which is a sexual reference, or the word bowl, which creates a confusion because it's not a bowl, it's a plate. But what I like very much about this plate is that the shadow is non-directional, that it has been drawn on the plate from all four sides, so it doesn't really have an orientation, although it may be speaking of orientation in another way. So it's quite interesting to see what happens when those kinds of things find themselves, those kinds of images, those kinds of representation, those kinds of activities find themselves on bowls, on plates, on ceramic objects that I have mentioned before are seen as quite innocent, domestic, ordinary, familiar, and it becomes a very interesting context of opposition and contradiction when those two things are put together. And what happens when very graphic, more or less pornographic images are placed within the context of decoration and flowers on dinnerware that is actually functional and can be used. And many artists and designers are investigating those possibilities. When you look at this dinner set by a French artist, it just looks like beautiful dinnerware that's quite decorative. But when you see that up close, the patterns are composed with bodies engaged in very graphic sexual activities. Your relationship to the familiarity of the form and their function becomes challenged in quite exciting ways. And many makers pushing the limit of that possibilities create work of offensive or shocking or quite difficult to assess. But again, I see how ceramics can engage with those kinds of relationship between the potential of pottery forms to engage with bodily and physical activities, with representations of body parts on those very objects themselves. And sometimes it's quite light and funny and a bit ridiculous as well. But it's also quite interesting to see, what happens when very suggestive forms are presented in a way that engages with that exchange and communication that happens around penetration, and issues of gender are brought in, and sexual activities and ingestion and so on. And you have this wonderful teapot by Chris Gustin, who is not specifically sexual in many ways, but it's immensely sensual in its form, in its texture, in its color, in the quality of the surface, and the references to openings and holes and things going in and things coming out are all very sexual in a very subtle way. And again, the wonderful pissoirs of Kim Dickey are wonderful objects of great sensuality that extend the relationship to the body that is implied by use. And again, work that can appear to be very light, very funny, more or less dismissible, but that can carry connections to masculinity versus femininity, and the whole domestic nature of ceramics as knickknacks, as cute things you put on shelves and never look at again and think about. And all of a sudden they challenge you to reassess your relationship to those things and create new signification for them. I really like those two cups by Mats Liederstam, as well as his butt vase on the right. The two cups are penetrating each other. They can change position. They have very tone of skin colors of two different tones. One is slightly lighter than the other. So they become the representation of a human being, of another person. And the cup becomes a stand-in for our whole body. And you handle it, you touch it, you use it, you bring it to your mouth, you change its position. Again, just two cups, two very simple tumblers, all of a sudden become pregnant with tremendous meaning and signification. And those wonderful 4 vases for a gynecologist's office on the left, or again this male and female version as a pair by Warren Mackenzie from the 1970s. Warren Mackenzie is a functional potter. He was a student of Bernard Leach and makes wonderful functional ceramics and pottery. And in the 1970s, he showed a young student like me that a thrown form could acquire qualities and make references and be metaphorical of activities and new connections to the body, to touch, that I had not conceived as possible before. And in that sense, he was enlightening for me and for many others. And contemporaries of his, Laurent Andreessen, Karen Carnes, you look at these works and you say, what's sexual about those objects, But the subtle references to female sexuality, to openings in bodies, once you know that both of those potters were lesbian, all of a sudden the relationship you have to those forms, the way they're organized and the way they're experienced, changes quite strategically and dramatically. And many artists and designers, again, this is an Italian designer making flower vases. You have uterus vases, vases in the shape of penises, penetrating mouths. In the recent past, if you go on the internet and do searches about ceramics and sexual things, you find a lot of this type of ware where people make casts of vaginas, cast of penises, just to show you that nobody is alike, we're all different. And those body parts, like all of us, come in a broad, wide, amazing variety of possibilities. And people make jewelry, making those references as well, combining silver and porcelain, making buttons out of body parts, making references to fruits, to natural forms, to plants, which are also very sexualized in so many exciting and interesting ways. The wonderful work of Anna G, who makes its presence felt in most of the aesthetics and most of the themes I have been talking about so far. With urogenital system females, she made those to explain sexuality to her young children. And they would have to point at a body part and name it, and then she would write the name on the little piece of white space reserved on the forms, and that's a way for her to explain sexuality to her kids. But she also made sex toys that could be, used and, engage in various sexual relations with bodies, with other people, and they're fun and they're playful. And the blue and white nature of the ceramic itself adds to the pleasurable nature of those objects. So many people make sex toys. Sex toys are quite popular. Whether they'd be very practical in ceramic itself is another story, but at the same time, it's interesting to consider how, the familiarity of the material, its tactility, its sensuality that's implied in the making itself engages with meaning with those kinds of objects in ways that are quite interesting. You know that those things were made by a hand. They probably are unique. They probably exist as only one example. And all of those things speaks of human communication and exchange in ways that are quite potent. You have the wonderful Viagra dispenser by Matt Nolan, or a condom plate by Kevin Petrie. What happens when you put a condom on a plate? Why do such a thing? And all of a sudden, your relationship to the condom and your relationship to the plate and the connotations they both carry becomes, inflated. The quite extraordinary work of Jason Briggs, who makes references to bodies in a rather graphic, illustrative way, but never in a first-degree manner. The references is always transformed by his amazing imagination and use of material. Simon Lee doing the same thing with her suspended breast, making references again to, feeding and giving and transforming and, our relationship to female bodies and how we are perceiving them, especially the black female body in her case. Well, Jeremy Hatch, again, with a very classical aesthetic form, references to framing that we saw within the narrative aesthetics, to decoration as well, makes references to inside-outside relationship, how a vessel is meant to be open, it's meant to be penetrated, things are meant to come out of, and within the fold of a clay form inserted within the familiar form of the vessel, all those relationship becomes apparent and obvious. Philip Eglin with his fellatio large buckets with an image on one side, a text on the other. We've looked at the relationship of ceramic to text and language before. This is an example of that. The amazing work of Grayson Perry, who has investigated issues of sexuality, of gender, of identity in so many different ways in his work and still does so. And another Turner Prize winner, Lord Prouveau, made this teapot with sexual references in all kinds of ways. And it's quite interesting that a prize as prestigious as the Turner Prize is sometimes given to somebody like Grayson Perry, who is a potter basically, or Lord Prouveau, who is a multimedia artist but who works in ceramics. And people working in all kinds of fields, in all kinds of material, in all kinds of art contexts are using ceramics more and more for its extraordinary potential to make wonderful work of great potential for metaphors and references of all kinds, to speak of child abuse, of pornography, and our very difficult and complex relations between sexuality and power and hierarchies and religion and many other things. And ceramics is actually at the ideal place to use those various things and combining them, because again it's the variety of contexts in which it operates, around dishes, around food, around eating, around being together and sharing things, and its domestic quality. And it is, I find fascinating to see how many artists in all over the world in so many different contexts are combining those various issues within the context not only of ceramic itself but of pottery form, which enhances and brings to an extreme level of contrast and opposition the form and the image. And this is an artist from India, and many work of this types have been produced in the recent past, are constantly produced as we speak. And I think because of all of those possibilities for ceramics to engage with us as human, as user of things, as people who have a need for those kinds of objects and those kinds of contexts, whether they be sexual contexts or the context of pottery forms for various uses and needs that we have for sustenance, for sharing, and coming together in all kinds of ways. And one of the reading I have of this type of work is beyond the fun quality, the ridiculous sort of jokey nature of many of those objects. They speak to us of those issues I've been mentioning in ways that no other material, no other kinds of objects, no other art form could do with such efficiency and poetry. Janno Blackburn's Salad is a series of 6 green body form in the more or less the shape of a bowl, as if you're looking at the content of the bowl instead of the form itself. And a number of bodies are engaged in sexual activities. Then there is only one. Then there is only part of the bodies, and then very close up to segments of the human shape. And at the very end, you only have fingers and toes and the tip of a penis, that from which a white body oozes out. And this speaks of the danger of sexuality and how we need to be careful and aware around those issues. And Richard Millet, again, making work using language, using references to specific minority sexual practices and references to other material in his work. Leopold Fulham reworking the Blue Willow pattern and the study of the Blue Willow pattern, which some of you may want to research further, and how 2 lovers come together and finally die, and here the lovers are the blue boy and a gardener. So the sexual connotation has been switched from heterosexuality to homosexuality. And this wonderful series of work by Craig Pace, whose work we've seen repeatedly as well, where he's not working in the negative space between the vases here. The image is in the vessel itself, in the profile that it draws in space. And one of those profiles is male and the other is female. And sometimes they appear to be getting closer and want to kiss, and sometimes they are moving away from one another and repelling one another, to speak of this attraction, opposition, repulsion that happens in human exchanges so very often. And of course the use of the black and the red references the classical surface we have discussed before. Even designers of wares that are meant to be, commercialized and sold have introduced very graphic sexual context in their work recently. There is a lot of that type of work being made now, where once you've put a liquid into the cup, it's as if a body is swimming into it or taking a bath or getting ready to submerge herself. Those references again can be quite subtle at time, and full of very sophisticated connotations around forms and bodies and uses and exchange, and making a cup, a very functional cup that you can use, that you can drink from, that you can partake in libations with friends that carry very interesting sexual connotation, sometimes of great subtlety, with references to the metaphorical potential of bodies to speak of all kinds of contexts and possibilities. Sarah Osaton here with her dinnerwares, and the one on the left is a cross-section of the vagina, and the one on the right is a cross-section of the penis. So again, sexual body parts becoming dishes for the serving and consumption of food. The work of Mark Burns, again from 1976, where he makes references to religion with Lot's wife and Sebastian at the bath, and bring in, the mystical quality of religion storytelling within the context of attraction and homosexuality. Tanya Batura with her wonderful bodies that have been sectioned and cut and maimed and are presented in an incomplete fashion in all kinds of ways that you can complete yourself. References to scrotum, to very fragmented aspect of sexual bodies, and Robert Arneson, always a precursor, always showing the way as early as 1965, making his memorial trophy with sexual aspects of all kinds, and his wonderful love bricks, which can be where one, it's not that it can be inserted into the other, there is not the necessary space in the vagina for to accommodate the penis, but it's in your own imagination that you have to see those bricks as sexualized, and what would happen if they were stacked and combined. Same thing with the phone here. Call Me Lover by Robert Arneson on the left, a work from the 1960s, and Leopold Fulham investigating something similar with his banana phone from a few years later. So Ryosaku Miwa from Japan making a shrine for himself and his wife after his death and her death, and celebrating the sexual nature of their relationship in the ancient queens and kings tomb. So even in the context of public art, in some places you have work where the potency and generative quality of sexual human parts can be used, while other people, within the context of giftware and cheapware and kitschware, again speak of that very deeply troublesome connection between bodies, sexualities, and human relationships. In my own The Moral Secret of Immortality, a stacked set of dishes, cups, bowl, plates, are organized in such a way that the cup censors the image, but when you take it apart, a penis in erection slowly grows, and the race and the age of the various bodies represented changes as well. So it's again a way to introduce the complexity of all those issues within the simplicity and familiarity of dinnerwares that creates the potency of those objects. And in my fluid exchange teapot and cup and saucer, the surface, the form, the relationship between the two, and the function of the object itself, as well as the representation on the things, all speak of fluid exchange in some ways. People making forms referencing vaginal form in sometimes quite subtle ways. People speaking of all kinds of sexual practices here in the context of the figurine that we have looked at previously. Making references to cultural precedents, historical work, Pre-Columbian ceramics in the case of Cocoli Velarde, an artist from Peru. I've shown you example of the work of those two artists before. It's, the use of animals instead of human bodies to represent human relationships and communication and so on. Sadashi Inuzuka, making forms thrown on the wheel and reassembled within the sexual context. You can now buy little figurines to put on your wedding cake of male, female, of course, but also male, male, female, female, to celebrate your commitments. And quite a few makers are investigating this new approach to human relationship in the expansion of the legality of marriage for everyone. And examples of that here in those plates that you can buy for friends if they get married under those circumstances. And those tiles, again, those very simple tiles with images of great primitive potency. And the very last image for today, this anonymous internet download of a kiss cup that embodies in a very beautiful way the connections between a cup and a saucer to exemplifies human contact in a wonderful way. See you next week for the last theme on death and the importance of funerary rites and funerary references in contemporary ceramics. See you soon. Bye.